yourself down. Don't get up. You're good. Don't do anything. Stop what you're doing. Don't do anything. Just stay in your bed all day. You are good.
Hi, I'm Michelle Hammer, and I have schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental illness that changes the way you think, feel, and act. It's broken down into 3 separate categories: positive, negative, and cognitive. Positive symptoms don't mean they're a good thing. It's an add-on to your normal behavior. Things like hallucinations, delusions, and voices.
You know, I had so many ghosts and shadows inside of my mind.
A demon was perching on the end of my bed.
Negative symptoms take away from your behavior.
I showed no emotion and I was just totally out of it.
Cognitive symptoms make it hard to pay attention and hard to focus.
Your brain is just racing. It can't stop.
Although its cause is not entirely known, schizophrenia is tied to an abundance of dopamine receptors, a subcortical overproduction of the neurotransmitter dopamine, and a localized shortage of dopamine in the prefrontal cortex. Dopamine is a monoamine neurotransmitter, a term that refers to its chemical structure and the fact that it is derived from an amino acid. Dopamine is also a catecholamine, a term that also refers to its chemical structure and the fact that it contains a catechol nucleus, which is a benzene ring with 2 adjacent hydroxyl groups and an ethylamine side chain. To synthesize dopamine, the amino acid tyrosine is converted to L-dopa by the enzyme tyrosine hydroxylase. Then L-dopa is decarboxylated by dopa decarboxylase to form dopamine. Within the brain, there are 3 main dopaminergic pathways that dopamine can take to be distributed: the nigrostriatal pathway, the mesolimbic pathway, and the mesocortical pathway. A malfunction at presynaptic neurons within the most centrally located pathway, the mesolimbic pathway, leads to an increased conversion of tyrosine into L-dopa and L-dopa into dopamine. Dopamine acts at G-protein coupled receptors, and there are at least 5 subtypes of the dopamine receptor, called D1, D2, D3, D4, and you guessed it, D5. Of particular importance in schizophrenia's positive symptoms is the D2 receptor, but we'll come back to that in just a second. Before dopamine can be released, the newly synthesized dopamine is stored in vesicles by vesicular monoamine transporter, or VMAT2. Dysfunction of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex correlates with the decline of dopamine concentration in the prefrontal cortex. The dopamine deficiency is often due to frontal lobe damage or otherwise altered cerebral structure that leads to fewer dopamine synthesizing terminals. This shortage couples with D1 receptor dysfunction, as well as the overall imbalance of D1 and D2 receptors in the prefrontal cortex, to lead to the negative and cognitive symptoms of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia symptoms are commonly treated with the benzoxazole atypical antipsychotic called risperidone, which has a moderately high affinity for the D2 receptor and a relatively weak affinity for the D1 receptor. Risperidone, as a D2 antagonist, blocks D2 receptors, preventing them from being overstimulated. It sits in the dopamine pocket in the 7 extracellular loops. It interacts with the D2 receptor mostly through hydrophobic interaction shown in gray, but it also interacts via hydrogen bonding shown in blue and pi-pi stacking shown in green. It may also act as a D1 antagonist, decreasing the receptor's ability to bind to dopamine. If this occurs, it likely has minimal impact on negative symptoms due to the low affinity of risperidone to the receptor. Risperidone does not bind to D3 receptors, the dopamine receptor likely linked to cognitive symptoms. This could be a target for future antipsychotic drugs. After administration, the drug is metabolized in the liver by cytochrome P450-2D6 or CYP2D6. This enzyme catalyzes the hydroxylation of risperidone to 9-hydroxyrisperidone, which can elicit clinical effects similar to unhydroxylated risperidone. The dopamine that is unable to bind to D2 receptors is removed from the synaptic cleft by a transporter protein called the dopamine transporter. The dopamine removed can follow one of 4 paths. It can be broken down by monoamine oxidase A or B into dihydroxyphenylacetic acid, or DOPAC, and then converted to homovanillic acid, or HVA, by catechol or methyltransferase, or COMT. Dopamine can react with COMT to form 3-methoxytyramine, or 3-MT, and then be converted to HVA by MAO-A or B. In the last 2 paths, dopamine is not broken down. In one scenario, it can be stored once again in vesicles by VMAT2, or it can bind to autoreceptors in the transmitting neuron, resulting in a negative feedback loop. This is how risperidone works to minimize the impact of positive symptoms of schizophrenia.
It can be very lonely having schizophrenia. The paranoia, the fear, the voices, everything that goes along with it.
The compliance with medications is going to ultimately lead to a recovery, and your son or daughter can not only be okay, but they can be great again.
Find a good doctor, find the meds that work. If you try hard enough and you really want to fix it, you can. Don't take your medication, feel better, and then think you don't need your medication anymore. It took a lot of pride that I had to say, I need medication, and I'm just gonna take it.
My advice to someone who's going through it is be honest. If you keep telling people you're fine, they'll believe it.
I believe there is a component beyond medical treatment that it has to be with education and creating positive voices that can influence and override the negative ones.
Just because they have schizophrenia doesn't mean that they can't be someone who will contribute to society, who can make the world a better place.